Okay, so today we're going to apply monopoly theory to what I think is a big social problem, the growing inequality in the United States, unlike many of the other countries in the developed world. And I'm going to try to persuade you that even from a sort of very libertarian perspective, redistribution may be valuable because it provides insurance against risks that people face before they're able to purchase insurance. And therefore, in some sense, it completes a market. Redistribution, thus conceived, aims to maximize average utility because that's what people would choose to maximize prior to knowing how wealthy they were. And I'm going to argue that concavity of utility will mean that you're going to want to give more money to the poor. And I'm going to use logarithmic utility as an approximation to that, which I'll try to ground in some empirical facts. Then we'll build a framework for analyzing optimal taxation. And we'll try to use that to study two different types of taxes. The sort of average tax rate that should be charged to most people. And we'll calibrate that using a log logistic distribution of income for most of the population. And then a special surcharge for people earning over $1 million, the super rich. And we'll calibrate that using the distribution of income among them, a Pareto distribution. We'll then look a little bit at evidence on labor supply elasticity. And I'll wrap up with some slides about some of the concerns or issues that are ignored in this main analysis. OK. So inequality, which is basically differences in the income that different individuals earn, come in three forms. One form is poverty, and this depends on what part of the distribution we're talking about. So poverty measures inequality at the very bottom. It's like how many people are really doing terribly versus just OK. And this is measured usually by the fraction of people below some line. There's a global poverty line of $1 a day, but the US poverty line is almost 100 times that level. And measures more how many people are doing much worse than the typical person is doing. And the interesting thing is that while other forms of inequality have been growing in recent years, poverty is not. In fact, it's fallen somewhat. Second issue is mid-range inequality, which measures sort of how much worse are people who are sort of doing fairly well doing than people who are doing fairly poorly. And this is usually measured by the Gini Coefficient, which measures how far from perfect equality a society is. So more graphically, on this line, we have where in the distribution of income you are. So the median person is here, and someone who's 80th percentile is here, et cetera. And the height of the curve says what fraction of national wealth does someone who do the bottom 80% of people earn, right? The Lorenz curve is that curve. And if everyone in the society was perfectly equal, then the bottom 50% of people would earn 50% of the wealth, right? And so forth. So we would have this line of equality. The area between the line of equality and the Lorenz curve divided by the total area gives you the Gini coefficient. OK. So the Gini coefficient has grown somewhat, especially during the 1980s, but it has not radically increased in the United States. The part of income distribution that has radically changed in the United States is what's taken by the top, the very top of the income distribution. And this is called top income shares, like what share is taken by the top 10%, the top 1%, et cetera. And this measures the concentration of income at the very top end of the distribution. And this has been growing incredibly radically in recent years. So to just give you a sense for that, this is, by the way, taking place almost exclusively at the absolute top of the income distribution, not among people who are doing pretty well but not great. So this is like really, really the top. So if you look at people who are in the top 10 to 5%, so those are like, educated, well-to-do people who are not raking it in, those people's income share has basically been almost completely flat during the 20th century. It's hardly changed at all. It was a little higher just until World War II, and then it fell during World War II, and then it climbed back to roughly a little bit, halfway in between where it was before and after World War II, but it's pretty much been steady. People who are in the 5 to 10%, so that's like, 150 to 350,000. So those are like rich people, but not super rich people. Those people followed a similar pattern to these guys, and then they came a little bit more back fully to where they were before World War II, but not that much. On the other hand, something radically different happened with the top 1%, people earning above $370,000. Up until the crash, they were doing great in 1929. They then came down, and much more during World War II and the Great Depression. They then continued to fall until 1978, and then there was this dramatic increase to the point where now they're almost earning 25% of national income. That means that they're almost earning as much as the next 9 percentage points of people combined. On the other hand, it's been completely different in Europe. So in Europe, they were basically where we were in the 20s with the top 1%. As we did, they fell down until you reach the 70s. So in 1978, their income shares were about 7, 8%, right? That's about where we were too. And then they continued falling, whereas we had this radical increase. Okay, so, and this has been happening in many countries around the world as well. So many libertarians and conservatives are opposed to redistribution. And I used to be a libertarian, actually, and so I sort of empathize with some of these views. So one view says, the rich earn their money. Who has the right to take it away from them? Some people say that, the rich are sort of more fit or more have, better things to do with the money or have, better projects to undertake, whatever, and that, it's better to select for them and then allow them to give money to charity, allow them to start businesses because they know better what to do with the money. Nozick said that it doesn't really matter where people end up. What matters is that there's a fair process by which they got there. And that if you start with a fair distribution of income and then there are a fair set of trades and you end up with a fair distribution of income, then whatever distribution of income you end up with must be fair. So that was Robert Nozick's argument. Protestant religion says that the wealthy are sort of chosen by God and that temporal powers should not interfere with that. Ayn Rand says that taxation is a form of violence and that property is sort of an inviolable part of what that person gives to the world and therefore can't be taken away. There's a fascist argument against redistribution, which is that the idea of redistribution tends to foster resentments between different classes and therefore reduce the solidarity of a country and therefore how well it works. Conservatives often argue that sort of each different class of society has its own role to play and that if you start mixing things up, things are less efficient because people sort of don't know what to do with the wealth and the wealthy don't know how to survive being poorer, right? So some of these arguments I think can sound a bit superficial, but I actually think some of them are powerful and I'll return to them below. And many of them have not really been completely formalized in economics, so I think they're sort of an interesting issue. But before we do that, I want to try to make a sort of almost libertarian argument for redistribution. And it's basically a formalization of the classic Christian saying from John Bradford. So John Bradford was a theologian in the 16th century, and he was talking to some friends in a comfortable setting, and these people walked by the door who were in chains going off to a work camp, basically. And they said to him, "Oh God, it's terrible, all these criminals, and they're going off to the camp. These people are dirt." Someone said that to him, and he said, "Look, there, but for the grace of God, go I." if I had not had the grace of God, I would have ended up in those people's position, right? And that's basically the idea that John Harsanyi, and you might associate this more with Jack Rawls, but actually he did it 20 years later, made about why we should have redistribution. So what was the Harsanyi-Rawls argument for redistribution, Daiichi?
Well, so I'm more familiar with Rawls, but basically
Yeah.
he thought that we should sort of like look at society from a veil of ignorance, where we don't know which position we would end up in.
Yeah.
Because people are risk averse, they would want a society that's more equitable, and so that would justify the distribution.
Yeah, so I think an even more libertarian way to think about this, very much along those lines, is that, you know, look, we observe all the time that people buy insurance against lots of stuff. They buy insurance on their health. They buy insurance on their house. They buy insurance on their cars, right? And I don't think any libertarian would want to shut down insurance markets, right? Now, there are some things that you can't buy insurance about because you're too young when you need to buy that insurance. So for example, imagine that you know, it would make a lot of sense for you to buy insurance against what college you get into, right? Because that has a huge effect on how well you do in the rest of your life, right? But you're not allowed to do that because you're too young, right? And that's not very efficient, right? It would make a lot of sense if the government could try to, or somebody could try to open up a market for insuring you against what college you get into, right? And I think a lot of people would buy that because it has a huge effect on how well you do for the rest of your life. Yeah?
Well, insurance is about equalizing the marginal utility of money, right? So if your utility is different in different states,
Yeah.
then people wouldn't buy insurance. Like you don't buy insurance like if your kid died, to use Becker's example.
No, I agree, but I mean, college has a huge effect on how much money you make for the rest of your life. And almost certainly money's worth more to you when you, I mean, I agree there are certainly some things where that's true, Andre, but I don't think that, I think college is clearly an example of that.
Job market for Econ PhD. If you fail.
Well, I'm not saying that that would be one you would want to insure necessarily, but because that, actually if you fail, you make more money usually. In fact, I gave that example to your class last year, and you're just recycling it back against me. But no, I mean, I think many of these things go in that direction. I mean, so, and if you start rolling back the clock 5 more years, you could say, well, at the age of 10, you know, wouldn't you like to buy insurance against whether you end up getting terrible acne, and you know, whether you end up being beautiful or ugly at the end of your adolescence, because that affects your life, and whether you end up being tall or short, et cetera, et cetera. And you roll that back another 5 years, and you'd like to buy insurance about, you know, how well your parents treat you, and what city you end up living in, and so forth. And you roll that back 5 more years, and you're just being born, and you'd like to buy insurance about what family you're born into, right? And what country you live in, and all that sort of stuff, right? And at each of these stages, it seems like that's a huge thing you definitely want to buy insurance about. And there's no market for providing that insurance because you're too young to sign the contract. So doesn't it make sense, in the absence of someone signing that contract, to try to do the thing that they would most likely have done had they been able to sign a contract then, rather than to just say, oh, well, there's no insurance at all, right? I mean, that's clearly, even from a libertarian's perspective, if you don't know what someone would have chosen, you try to do the best job you can do of guessing what they would have chosen and doing that for them.